The government could end the carbon tax today, even with Parliament shut down. And that means you shouldn't be paying the carbon tax on one more home heating bill or on one more trip to the gas station. Now, Liberal Party leader Mark Carney has repeatedly said that he would immediately end the consumer carbon tax. OK, so listen to what Carney said when he was campaigning to be the leader of the Liberal Party.
My government will immediately remove the consumer carbon tax.
Now, remember, folks, the carbon tax is still scheduled to increase by 19% on April 1. But Environment Minister Steven Guilbeault seems unsure how the government would end the carbon tax. So listen to what Guilbeault said.
Minister Guilbeault, do you expect Carney to get rid of the consumer carbon tax before he calls an election?
Well, he said yesterday that he wanted to get rid of it. We're looking into how that could be done and how rapidly it can be done.
Do you expect this to happen, though, before the election is called?
As I said, we're looking into it. I don't have, a time to give you. We're looking into different options. Do we need to change legislation? Can we go the regulatory route? What are the options? And I don't have an answer for you yet.
Well, the minister doesn't seem sure on what to do, so let's give him some free advice. And with that, I'm going to bring in the Canadian Taxpayers Federation's in-house lawyer, Devin Drover, who's going to explain how the government could end the carbon tax today, immediately, even though Parliament is shut down. So for starters, Devin, can the government end the carbon tax immediately, even though Parliament is shut down and can't pass legislation?
Absolutely, Franco. This is outrageous that this is even up for discussion right now. The government absolutely could end the carbon tax right now. Doesn't matter if Parliament is closed. The carbon tax could end today.
There you have it, folks. Well, Devin, let's actually give some advice. Explain the details of how the government could end the carbon tax, even though Parliament shut down.
Absolutely, Franco. So as some listeners know, the carbon tax is made by law. Shocker. Some Canadian law, like the law that made the carbon tax, does allow some decisions to be made by what's known as regulations. So this essentially defers some of the power within a piece of legislation to what is dubbed the Governing Council, which what the heck does that mean? It really just means the Prime Minister and the Cabinet can make some decisions about how laws are made. So, for example, under the carbon tax law in Canada, the amount of the carbon tax, what it applies to, these are things that are deferred not just within the legislature, but is deferred by the laws to the discretion of the cabinet to make decisions. The cabinet can make regulations on who pays the carbon tax, what the carbon tax is going to be. And Minister Guilbeault has made these regulations in the past. If you look at the exemption to home heating fuel on the carbon tax home heating exemption mostly in Atlantic Canada, that was made by regulations that he signed off on. So this is not some foreign concept. So even without recalling Parliament, soon-to-be Prime Minister Mark Carney and the cabinet ministers could make a decision in a cabinet meeting. They could call one today. They could call one right now to set the carbon tax rate, for example, on gasoline, to be $0 per liter, effectively ending the carbon tax right this second.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, right? That the government can unilaterally change the carbon tax rate to zero today without passing legislation. They could change the carbon tax rate to zero, i.e. ending the carbon tax, the consumer carbon tax, at least, that Canadians are paying. And I'm also glad you brought that up because, Devin, it reminds me of when the Canadian Taxpayers Federation was fighting the carbon tax in the courts. Wasn't that one of the arguments that we were making in the courts?
Yeah, absolutely. And the thing is, it's fundamentally, it is undemocratic to have these tax decisions being made, without legislative approval. So what makes it really scary in this case is we have Mark Carney say that he wants to scrap the consumer carbon tax. He could do it immediately. He could call his cabinet and get them to scrap the carbon tax, make it $0. But also the opposite is true. Yeah. If the Prime Minister, if soon-to-be Prime Minister Mark Carney happens to win the next election, he could say, okay, well, Parliament's still closed, but what I'm going to do anyways is I'm going to hike that carbon tax back up to whatever amount him and his cabinet decides. without Parliament ever voting on it. So it is fundamentally undemocratic in many ways. And, I think it presents a scary thought for Canadians. And that's why it's not only important for this government to scrap the carbon tax by immediately by making it $0. But the first thing Parliament needs to do when it reopens, if Mark Carney is serious about the carbon tax not being the consumer carbon tax continuing on Canadians, then the first act of his government once the Parliament reopens is to scrap the legislation itself. So short term, yes, absolutely, the government could act right now and make the carbon tax $0 on effectively on things like gasoline or heating your home. But in the long term, the first thing the government needs to do to show they're serious about this and they're just not putting, trying to distract from current polling or from other issues is to get rid of the legislation, the law that makes the carbon tax a thing to begin with.
All right, folks. So here's the key takeaways. OK, so Carney said he would immediately end the consumer carbon tax. Now, that Carney isn't ending all carbon taxes, right? Carney still wants to hammer Canadian businesses with carbon taxes, and he hopes you won't notice when businesses pass those costs on to you through higher prices. But Carney should still live up to his commitment and end the consumer carbon tax, right? He could end it today, and he should, and he could end that consumer carbon tax even though Parliament is shut down. And folks, I also want you to know that the Canadian Taxpayers Federation is going to keep fighting with you until all carbon taxes are completely scrapped. And if you haven't already, you can join that fight by heading over to taxpayer.com and signing the petition, Scrap the Carbon Tax.